On today's episode of PwC's IFRS Talks, we are discussing the targeted amendments that the IASB recently made to the accounting guidance that's applicable to contracts that reference nature-dependent electricity. I'm your host, Olaf Pusch, and I'm joined by Roger Sagmoen, a senior manager in our Global Corporate Reporting Services team. We are seeing contracts that reference nature-dependent electricity more and more now, because entities try to find carbon-neutral ways to power their businesses. And the accounting prior to these recent amendments did pose some challenges. I want to find out what problems the amendments try to fix with regards to these contracts and how the IASB actually fixed them. Hi Roger, thanks for joining us on IFRS Talks. How are you doing today?
I am very well. Thanks for inviting me, Olaf.
Well, glad to have you here. I would like to aim today's podcast at everyone that may have heard about these targeted amendments to IFRS and wants to know a little bit more about them. Of course, on a basic level, so let's keep it easy. And I think to get that basic understanding, we need to know first about these so-called nature-dependent electricity contracts, or some folk may also call them renewable power purchase agreements. What actually are they, Roger?
Yeah, sure. So that's a good starting point. So nature-dependent power purchase agreements, or we also refer to them as PPA, they provide for delivery of electricity which is generated from an uncontrollable source, such as, for example, wind or the sun, for a fixed price. We generally describe these as physical PPAs. That is because we also have virtual ones, virtual PPAs. So instead of the entity paying for the actual electricity being produced by, say, the wind farm, the entity just pays or receives cash, which equals the difference between an agreed fixed price and the spot price of that nature-dependent electricity. And these virtual PPAs, or VPPAs, they are accounted for as financial instruments. So the difference between a physical and a virtual PPA is whether electricity is being delivered. In the case of a physical PPA, you purchase electricity and pay for it. For a virtual one, you just settle the difference between an agreed price and the spot price, and you don't receive electricity delivered under that contract. From an accounting perspective, what is meant by delivery is therefore quite important. And I need to say the meaning of delivery has not been changed by the amendments either. But there is an IFRS decision from 2005, which is quite helpful when we talk about electricity. Because in that agenda decision, the IFRS observed that the meaning of delivery is not limited to physical delivery of the underlying to the buyer, which is quite helpful for electricity because it doesn't have a physical substance. But in accordance with that IFRS decision, when electricity, for example, is allocated to the entity's account at the grid, that could be considered delivery. And I also want, in the intro, maybe to say that these arrangements, they also typically come with the environmental attributes, such as renewable energy certificates. But the amendments, they don't address the accounting for those, so I suggest we keep them out of this podcast.
Okay, that makes sense, Roger. Just to reiterate, so whether there is delivery or not, that's quite important. And I hear you say that that's a key difference between the physical PPA and the virtual PPAs. So now, having talked about a difference, what is actually similar? What do physical PPAs and virtual PPAs have in common?
So when we talk about nature-dependent arrangement, one feature the physical and the virtuals have in common is the variability in volume. And that's because the source of electricity production is dependent on natural conditions that cannot be controlled. So let's take the example of a wind farm should be. So when we talk about a physical PPA, the purchaser would get the electricity delivered from the wind farm as and when it is produced. And that obviously depends on if and when the wind blows. So the volume which is purchased will vary between the delivery intervals. When we talk about a virtual PPA, the entity would settle net in cash, the difference between the fixed price and the spot price, based on the volume which is generated by the wind farm. So again, there is variability because the volumes that get factored into the net settlement of the contract varies based on when the wind blows.
Okay, I got it. So the similarity is that for both types, you have nature-dependent sources, and because of that, we have this variability around if and how much power is actually generated. Makes sense because no one controls the wind, as you say, and neither the sunshine. So why was IFRS 9 then or why was an amendment needed for these contracts? What are the issues?
Yeah, maybe let's start with the physical PPAs, because many commodity contracts, such as for electricity, they end up in IFRS 9 because the underlying commodity is readily convertible to cash. And then you might say, but why is that the case? Because if I have a contract to buy, say, a widget to use in my own factory, I do not account for that contract as a financial instrument. So what is different between with a commodity? And I think that the way IFRS 9 deals with that question is that if you intend to receive and take use of the contracted volume of electricity, well, then the contract is not in the scope of IFRS 9 anyway. Then it would be accounted for as a normal purchase or sales contract rather than at fair value through profit and loss. So essentially, when you buy what you need for your own purposes, then it's an own-use contract. But the own-use assessment has been particularly challenging for some of these electricity contracts because, as we say, the supply is unpredictable. It depends on natural sources such as the wind and the sun. And in addition, electricity is currently not practical and economically storable at scale. And the way electricity markets are structured, you would always or often be required to resell any unused volumes into the market. So in these cases, you could then end up buying more electricity than you need at a particular time of delivery and being forced to sell that into the market. So that's how you can see that this presents quite a few challenges when assessing the own-use exception for these contracts.
Okay, got it. I understand the challenges. So you might fail the own-use exception because you have to sell some electricity rather than using all of it. So how do these new amendments then help?
Well, they clarify that sales of unused electricity are not necessarily inconsistent with the contract being held for own use under certain conditions. And that is when the entity is required to buy and take delivery of nature-dependent electricity when it is produced, and the entity has no practical ability to determine if and when to sell any unused volumes because of how the market is structured. And then under those conditions, essentially the own-use exception is met if the entity has been and expects to be a net purchaser of electricity in the same market as it bought the nature-dependent electricity over the contract period. So in other words, when you end up buying more than you sell, then you're a net purchaser.
And what are the time periods over which an entity should make that assessment?
Well, that is an area of judgment. So the entity needs to determine what is a reasonable period of time for that assessment, considering both the variability in the electricity production, such as because of seasonality, and also in its own operating cycle. But there is a 12-month backstop. So when an entity determines whether it has been a net purchaser of electricity, the period over which that assessment is made should not exceed 12 months.
Okay, so those amendments seem quite reasonable to me. They kind of acknowledge that sales can't be avoided in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe let's move over to the virtual PPAs now. I recall you said that those are the ones which are not for actual delivery of the electricity. So what are the accounting requirements for those then? I take it for those, because again there is no delivery, you cannot be under the own-use exception.
There's no delivery of electricity under a virtual contract, so there's no electricity use either. Rather, these contracts, they contain an electricity swap or a derivative, which is accounted for under IFRS 9 at fair value through profit and loss. But those who buy or sell electricity in the spot market, they are obviously exposed to variability in their results and the cash flows because the electricity price fluctuates. And I think from being an electricity customer in Europe over the last few years, we can obviously confirm that. But that is where a VPPA can be a very helpful tool, because it economically exchanges the spot price for a fixed price for that amount of electricity on which it is net settled. And from an accounting perspective, you can designate that contract in a hedge relationship to reduce the volatility you would otherwise have had.
Yeah, you're speaking about volatility. I can see that volatility in my own utility bills. They haven't really been stable or low over the last couple of years, but maybe taking jokes aside, what are the challenges that entities have experienced when hedging with these VPPAs?
Well, again, the root cause is the variable and unpredictable volume. Because remember, as we said in the introduction, these contracts are settled net in cash based on an amount of electricity that is nature dependent, such as a proportion of the sale from the wind farm. So it's basically the wind that determines the volume on which it is net settled. And IFRS 9 requires the hedged item, that is what you want to hedge, in this case the future purchases or sales of electricity, that has to be formally designated and documented at the inception of the hedge. And this is where the variable volume has created issues, maybe not at least so for the seller, say the wind farm, with a VPPA in light of an IFRS Interpretation Committee IFRIC decision from 2019. We typically refer to that as the load following swap decision after the particular instrument then being discussed by the IFRIC. But according to that IFRIC decision, the wind farm would have to specify the future sales it wants to hedge in terms of both timing and magnitude at the inception of the hedge. So when the wind farm makes a sale, it should be able to identify whether that is a hedged sale. And what does that mean? Well, say the wind farm has a VPPA which is net settled based on 100% of its sales. So economically, each and every megawatt of electricity the wind farm sells is economically hedged by the VPPA. But the wind farm cannot designate the hedged item as 100% of its sales, because that will not meet the required specificity. Obviously, the wind farm would know only after the end of the period the exact number of megawatts and the timing of those sales.
And tell me, the amendments also address this issue?
They do. And I think the amendments are quite helpful both for the buyer and the seller with a VPPA. It's important now to remember that these amendments, they can only be applied for hedge relationships where a nature-dependent electricity contract is designated as the hedging instrument, so they cannot be applied to other hedge relationships. But they do two things. One is that they allow the hedged item to be designated as a variable volume, which is aligned with the amount expected to be delivered by the wind farm in the VPPA in our example under hedging instrument. And the second is that a forecast transaction is presumed to be highly probable if the cash flows under the hedging instrument are conditional on that designated forecast transaction occurring.
Okay, thanks. Especially those two things sound quite technical in terms of these amendments. Can you tell us what that means in practice?
Yeah, sure. I mean, hedge accounting is a little bit technical, but let's start with the buyer. That is the entity that buys electricity. So the hedged item, in this case, that will be the future purchases of electricity. That can mirror the volume of the VPPA if the entity has sufficient highly probable purchases to cover that volume. And remember that the VPPA with the wind farm and the entity's purchases, they are not directly related, right? So the entity cannot just look at the expected volume of the VPPA and presume it would have an equal amount of future purchases that are highly probable, because the entity would need to consider its operational needs for electricity in that assessment. But with that designation, using the new amendments now, there will be no hedge ineffectiveness arising because of as a direct effect of the variable volume of the VPPA. And that is because the hedged item is aligned with that variable volume. But as we said, there is no contractual link between the VPPA and the hedged item. So there could be other potential sources of hedge ineffectiveness in such a hedge. For example, if there's differences in timing, or pricing differences because the wind farm operates in a different market than the purchaser, for example. But if we look at the seller, that is our wind farm, I think it's even better news because those sales the wind farm designates as the hedged item that are the same as those on which the VPPA is settled. So the wind farm can designate the hedged item as 100% of the sales, which is referred to in the VPPA, and that without any constraint relating to the highly probable assessment. And to me that makes perfectly sense because it is those sales the wind farm has designated as the hedged item that triggers cash flows under the VPPA. And in addition, when we talk about the wind farm, there is a contractual link between the VPPA and the hedged item, its future sales. So there will be no differences in volume or timing, nor in basis price if the VPPA is indexed with the spot market.
Okay, great. I can see that makes a difference in terms of being able to apply the hedge accounting. So overall, seems like really good news for people. But I guess the quid pro quo on getting these helpful amendments is that there probably is some new disclosure requirements you're going to tell us about.
Yeah, sure there is, because stakeholders, they have asked for transparency into this contract. They are typically very long term. And in particular for those that are accounted for as own-use contracts, there's obviously no sign of them on the statement of financial position. So for those contracts that are accounted for as own-use contracts applying these amendments, there are certain disclosure requirements. And one is to disclose information about those contractual terms that expose the entity to variability in the underlying amount of electricity and the risk that you might be required to buy electricity in a delivery interval in which you cannot use the electricity. There's also disclosure requirements around unrecognized contractual commitments relating to these contracts, and also certain quantitative information related to the financial statements for the period.
Okay, and in terms of hedge accounting, anything there to disclose?
Yeah, there's not much for hedge accounting, but IFRS 7 currently requires disclosure of terms and conditions of hedging instrument by risk category. So the amendments now require an entity to disaggregate this information, so it's separately disclosed for nature-dependent electricity contract designated as hedging instruments.
Okay, sounds good. So when can companies actually apply this?
Well, they are effective for annual reporting periods beginning on or after the 1st of January 2026, and early adoption is, of course, permitted.
That's great. Thanks, Roger. So I suspect many companies will want to actually adopt this early because it all seems quite helpful, right?
Yeah, I think we hear quite a lot positive feedback on this from around our network. So we expect entities wanting to adopt this early. It's obviously subject to endorsement where that is applicable. And I think, as you said, it's overall very good news. And it's also important maybe at the end to say this project originated from an IFRIC submission in April 2023. And we now have final amendments to IFRS 9 less than 2 years later. So I think we can fairly say that the IASB has also put quite a lot of power into this project.
I like it. Thanks, Roger. So actually, yes, I agree. It's a great achievement and really positive that so shortly after the problem was identified through that submission, you mentioned that the IASB found a solution for this. So I guess that brings us to the end of our podcast. For more information about the amendments, we have published an in-brief, which you can find on Viewpoint. That's our global platform for relevant accounting knowledge. Thank you again, Roger, for your insights, and thank you also to our listeners. To never miss an episode, remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, happy accounting and reporting.
This podcast has been brought to you by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP. This content is for general information purposes and is not a substitution for consultation with professional advisors.